Hi, boys and girls. Welcome back. It's Mrs. Santos as we read together of Because of Winn-Dixie, chapters 15 and 16. So I'm going to share my screen and we're all good. Okay, chapter 15. The Herman W. Block Memorial Library air conditioning unit didn't work very good, and there was only one fan. And from the minute me and Winn-Dixie got in that library, he hogged it all. He lay right in front of it and wagged his tail and let it blow his fur all around. Some of his fur was pretty loose and blew right off of him like a dandelion puff. I worried about him hogging the fan, and I worried about the fan blowing him bald. But Miss Franny, she said not to worry about either thing. That Winn-Dixie could hog the fan all he wanted, and she had never in her life seen a dog made bald by a fan. Sometimes when Miss Franny was telling a story, she would have a fit. There were these small fits, and that they didn't last long, but what happened was she would forget what she was saying. She would just stop and start to shake like a little leaf. And when that happened, when Dixie would get up from the fan and sit right at Miss Franny Block's side, he would sit up tall, protecting her with his ears standing up straight on his head like soldiers. And when Miss Franny stopped shaking and started talking again, when Dixie would lick her hand and lie back down in front of the fan. So she was probably having a seizure. A seizure means like her brain is just kind of shutting off for a little bit and then she's coming right back. But there's a lot of activity happening in her brain where she's not focused, she's not there with you. Whenever Franny had one of her fits, it reminded me of when Dixie in a thunderstorm. There were a lot of thunderstorms that summer. And I got a real good at holding on to Winn-Dixie whenever they came. I held on to him and comforted him and whispered to him and rocked him just the same way he tried to comfort Miss Franny when she had her fits. Only I held on to Winn-Dixie for another reason too. I held on him tight so he wouldn't run away. It all made me think about Gloria Dump. I wondered who comforted her when she heard those bottles knocking together, those ghosts clattering about the things she had done wrong. I wanted to comfort Gloria Dump, and I decided that the best way to do that would be to read her a book, read it to her loud enough to keep the ghosts away. And so I walked to Miss Franny. I said, Miss Franny, I've got a grown up friend whose eyes are going on her, and I would like to read her a book out loud. Do you have any suggestions? Suggestions, Miss Franny said. Why, yes, ma'am, I have suggestions. Of course, I have suggestions. How about Gone with the Wind? What's that about? I asked her. Why, said Miss Franny, it's a wonderful story about the Civil War. The Civil War, I said. Do not tell me you have never heard the Civil War. Miss Franny Block looked like she was going to faint. She waved her hands in front of her face. I know about the Civil War, I told her. That was the war between the South and the North over slavery. Yes, slavery, said Miss Franny. It was also about states' rights and money, and it was a terrible war. My great grandfather fought in that war. He was just a boy. Your great grandfather? Yes, ma'am. Litmus W Block. Now there's a story. When Dixie yawned a real big, and lay down on his side and thumped in a sigh. I swear he knew that phrase. Now there's a story. And he knew it meant we weren't going anywhere real soon. Go ahead and tell it to me, Miss Franny, I said, and I sat down cross-legged next to Winn-Dixie. I pushed him and tried to get him to share the fan, but he pretended he was asleep, and he wouldn't move. I was all settled in and ready for a good story when the door banged and pinch-faced Amanda Wilkinson came in. When Dixie sat up and stared at her, he tried out a smile on her, but she didn't smile back, and so he lay down again. I'm ready for another book, Amanda said, slamming her book down at Miss Franny's desk. Well, said Miss Franny, maybe you wouldn't mind waiting. I'm telling India Opal a story about my great-grandfather. You are, of course, more than welcome to listen. It'll just be 1 minute. Amanda sighed, a real dramatic sigh, and stared past me. She pretended like she wasn't interested, but I could tell she was. Come over here, said Miss Franny. I'll stand, thank you, said Amanda. Suit yourself. Miss Franny shrugged. Now, where was I? Oh, yes, Litmus W Block. And so, what I want to do before I read chapter 16 is give you a little bit of history about the Civil War. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up another window, and we're going to watch this video. Oh, of course. I'm going to log in. Bella told Dad not to watch his dishes right now. And so this is a little bit of history about the Civil War. It's a horrible war between the North and the South, and it happened in the United States.
Check. Huh? Hey. Dear Tim and Moby, what happened during the Civil War? From Jen. Well, it all started in 1860 and 1861 when 11 southern states seceded. That means they left the United States to make their own country. They called themselves the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy. The states that stayed with the U.S. were the Union. Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States at the time, and Jefferson Davis became president of the Confederacy. Lincoln couldn't allow 11 states to leave the Union because he thought it would set a bad example for the future. Anytime a state didn't like the rules, they would just leave. Well, the secession was like the trigger for the Civil War. The long-term cause was the disagreement between northern and southern states over slavery. There were some other factors as well. You can learn more in our Civil War Causes movie. Anyway, the actual fighting between the Union and Confederacy started in April of 1861. Confederate soldiers fired on Fort Sumter, a U.S. Army outpost in South Carolina. South Carolina was a Confederate state, and they wanted Fort Sumter for their own military use. But when South Carolina attacked the fort, they were attacking American soldiers. President Lincoln declared the South in rebellion, and the Civil War began. Every state had to decide which side to join. Border states like Kentucky and Delaware were pro-slavery but anti-secession. In fact, West Virginia was formed from the parts of Virginia that refused to secede with the rest of the state. In the end, 24 states stayed with the Union. The Union was ready to fight. People lined up around the block to join the Army. Everyone in the North thought the war would be fast and easy. After all, it was 24 states versus 11. Lincoln himself expected it to last only 90 days. The first major battles of the Civil War actually drew spectators. People would have picnics on the hills overlooking the fighting. The North lost a lot of major battles in the beginning. Robert E. Lee, the commander of all the Confederate armies, was an effective strategist and engineer, and his experience earned him some early victories. One of the biggest early victories for the South was the First Battle of Bull Run, sometimes called the First Battle of Manassas. The Union came up with its answer to Robert E. Lee. Ulysses S. Grant was a talented general for the Union Army who would eventually become its commanding officer. He helped the North turn the tide toward victory, but casualties were extremely high. The Battle of Shiloh in April 1862 ended with 24,000 casualties on both sides, including around 3,400 dead. In 1863, in the middle of the war, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves held in Confederate-controlled states. Well, slavery was pretty much over in the northern states, but a few of the border states like Maryland still held slaves. In fact, the Union Army had formed units of all African American soldiers by then. Slavery was officially outlawed in all states in 1865, after the Civil War ended. The Battle of Gettysburg in the summer of 1863 was the turning point of the war. Gettysburg ended with a staggering 51,000 casualties, with about 6,700 people dead. President Lincoln visited the battlefield when it was all over and delivered his famous Gettysburg Address. In just a handful of sentences, Lincoln captured the nation's grief and its determination to endure. In November of 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman made a famous march across Confederate Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah. In Sherman's march to the sea, the Union troops devastated the state by burning crops, killing livestock, and wrecking the local infrastructure. By 1865, the Confederacy was exhausted. It had lost a huge percentage of its young men, and its economy was destroyed. General Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9, 1865. The war was over. Only 5 days later, on April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated while watching a play in Washington, D.C. His killer was a man named John Wilkes Booth, a Maryland actor who was angry about the South's defeat. So, that's the Civil War. By the time it was over, between 600,000 and 700,000 people were dead, out of a total of about 3 million combatants. It was America's bloodiest war, by a lot. Yeah. By the way, that Union General, Ulysses S. Grant, he went on to become president in 1868. Okay, you can't just take my pieces off the board. Do you even know how to play?
Silly Moby. Okay, so that's just some background of the Civil War. It's not a very good time in American history, and a lot of lives were lost. So that's just a little bit of context of what happened to Litmus W Block, Franny Block's. Remember, she's a librarian. This is Franny Block's great grandfather. Litmus W. Block was just a boy when the firing at Fort Sumter occurred, Miss Franny Block said as she started on her story. Fort Sumter, I said. It was the firing at Fort Sumter that started the war, said Amanda. Okay, I said, and I shrugged. Well, Litmus, he was just 14 years old. He was strong and big, but he was still just a boy. His daddy, Artley W. Block, had already enlisted. Enlisted means signed up for the war. And Litmus told his mama that he could not stand by and let the South get beat. And so he went to fight, too. Miss Franny looked around the library, and then she whispered, men and boys always want to fight. They're always looking for some reason to go to war. It's the saddest thing. They have this abiding notion that war is fun, and no history lesson will ever convince them differently. It is not fun. That's what Miss Franny is saying. Anyway, Litmus went and enlisted. He lied about his age. Yes, ma'am. Like I said, he was big boy, and the army took him, and Litmus went off to war, just like that. Left behind his mother and 3 sisters. He went off to be a hero, but he soon found out the truth. Miss Franny closed her eyes and shook her head. What truth? I asked her. Well, that war is hell, Miss Franny said with her eyes still closed. Pure hell. Hell is a cuss word, said Amanda. I stole a look at her. Her face was pinched up more than usual. War, said Miss Franny with her eyes still closed, should be a cuss word too. She shook her head and opened her eyes. She pointed at me, and then she pointed at Amanda. You, neither of you, can imagine. No, ma'am, Amanda and me said at exactly the same time. We looked real quick at each other and then back at Miss Franny. You cannot imagine. Litmus was hungry all the time. He was covered with all manner of vermin, fleas, and lice. And in the winter, he was so cold, he thought for sure he would freeze to death. And in the summer, why, there's nothing worse than war in the summertime. It stinks so. And the only thing that made Litmus forget that he was hungry and itchy and hot or cold was that he was getting shot at. And he got shot at quite a bit. And he was nothing more than a child. Did he get killed? I asked Miss Franny. Well, good grief, said Amanda. She rolled her eyes. Now, Opal, Miss Franny said, I wouldn't be standing in this room telling you this story if he was killed. I wouldn't exist. No, ma'am. He had to live. But he was a changed man. Yes, ma'am. A changed man. He walked back home when the war was over, and he walked from Virginia all the way back to Georgia, and he didn't have a horse. Nobody had a horse except for the Yankees. He walked, and when he got home, there was no home there. Where was it? I asked her. I didn't care if Amanda thought I was stupid. I just wanted to know. Wow, Miss Franny shouted so loud that Winn-Dixie and Amanda Wilkinson and me all jumped. The Yankees burned it! Yes, ma'am, burned it to the ground. What about his sisters? Amanda asked. She moved around her desk and came and sat on the floor. She looked up at Miss Franny. What happened to them? Dead. Dead of typhoid fever. Oh, no, Amanda said in a real soft voice. And his mama? I whispered. Dead too. And his father? Amanda asked. What happened to him? He died on the battlefield. Litmus was an orphan. Litmus was an orphan? I asked. Yes, ma'am, said Miss Franny Block. Litmus was an orphan. This is a sad story, I told Miss Franny. It sure is. I'm recording and you keep opening or closing the door. Please stop. Please don't shut it. I'm recording right now. I appreciate that. Okay. This is a sad story, I told Miss Franny. It sure is, said Amanda. I was amazed that she was agreeing with me about something. I'm not done yet, Miss Franny said. Winn-Dixie started to snore, and I nudged him with my foot to try to make him quit. I wanted to hear the rest of the story, and it was important to me to hear how Litmus survived after losing everything he loved. Chapter 17. Well, Litmus came home from the war, said Miss Franny, as she went on with her story, and found himself alone. And he sat down on what used to be the front step of his house, and he cried and he cried and he cried like a baby. He missed his mama and he missed his daddy and he missed his sisters and he missed the boy he used to be. When he finally finished crying, he had the strangest sensation. He felt like he wanted something sweet. He wanted a piece of candy. He hadn't had a piece of candy in years. And it was right then that he made a decision. Yes, ma'am, Litmus W Block figured the world was a sorry affair and that it had enough ugly things in it. And what he was going to do was concentrate on putting something sweet in it. He got up and started walking. He walked all the way to Florida. And the whole time he was walking, he was planning. Planning what? I said. Why, planning the candy factory. Did he build it? I asked. Of course he did. It's still standing out on Fairville Road. That old building, said Amanda. That's big spooky. That big spooky one? It's not spooky, said Miss Franny. It was the birthplace of the family fortune. It was there that my great-grandfather manufactured the Litmus Lounge, a candy that was famous all over the world. I've never heard of it, said Amanda. Me neither, I said. Well, said Miss Franny, there aren't many made anymore. The world, it seems, lost its appetite for Litmus lounges, but I still happen to have a few. And she opened the top drawer of her desk, and it was full of candy. She opened the top drawer below, and it was full of candy too. Miss Franny Block's whole desk was full of candy. Would you care for a Litmus lounge? She asked Amanda and me. Yes, please, said Amanda. Sure, I said. Can Winn-Dixie have one too? I've never known of a dog that cared for hard candy, said Miss Franny, but he's welcome to try one. Miss Franny gave Amanda one Litmus Lounge and me two. I unwrapped one and held it out to Winn-Dixie. He sat up and sniffed it and wagged his tail and took the candy from between my fingers real gentle. He tried to chew on it, and when that didn't work, he just swallowed the whole thing in one big gulp. Then he wagged his tail at me and lay back down. I ate my Litmus Lounge slow. It tasted good. It tasted like root beer and strawberry and something else I didn't have a name for. Something that made me feel kind of sad. I looked over at Amanda, and she was sucking on her candy and thinking hard. Do you like it? Miss Franny asked me. Yes, ma'am, I told her. What about you, Amanda? Do you like the Litmus Lounge? Yes, ma'am, she said, but it makes me think of things I feel sad about. I wondered what in the world Amanda Wilkinson had to feel sad about. She wasn't new in town. She had a mom and a daddy. I had seen her with them in church. There's a secret ingredient in there, Miss Franny said. I know it. I told her. I can taste it. What is it? Sorrow. Sorrow means sadness. Miss Franny said, not everybody can taste it. Children especially seem to have a hard time knowing it's there. I'll taste it, I said. Me too, said Amanda. Well then, Miss Franny said, you've probably had your share of sadness. I had to move away from Watley and leave all my friends, I said. That is one sadness I've had. And Dunlap and Stevie Dewberry are always picking on me. That's another sadness. And the biggest one, my biggest sadness, is that my mama left me when I was still small, and I could hardly remember her. I keep hoping I get to meet her and tell her some stories. It makes me miss Carson, said Amanda. She sounded like she was going to cry. I have to go. And she got up and almost ran out of the Herman W. Block Memorial Library. Who's Carson? I asked Miss Franny. She shook her head. Sorrow, she said. It is a sorrow filled world. But how do you put that in a piece of candy? I asked her. How do you get that taste in there? That's the secret, she said. That's why Litmus made a fortune. He said that's why he manufactured a piece of candy that tasted sweet and sad at the same time. Can I have a piece to take to my friend Gloria Dump and another one to take to Otis down in Gertrude's Pets? Girls, go to the garage. Go speak in the garage. And one for the preacher and one for Sweetie Pie too. You may have as many as you want, said Miss Franny. And so I stuffed my pockets full of Litmus longes and I thanked Miss Franny for her story. And I checked out Gone with the Wind, which was a very big book. And I told Winn-Dixie to get up, and the two of us left and went over to Gloria Dump's. I rode right past Dewberry's house. Dunlap and Stevie were playing football in the front yard. And I was just getting ready to stick my tongue out at them. But then I thought about what Miss Franny said about war being hell. And I thought about what Gloria Dump said about not judging them too hard. And so I just waved instead. They stood and stared at me. But when I was almost all the way past, I saw Dunlap put his hand up in the air and waved back. Hey! He hollered, hey, Opal. I waved harder and I thought about Amanda Wilkinson and how it was neat that she liked a good story the same way thing I did. And I wondered again, who was Carson? And we'll stop right there with chapters um, 15, 16, and 17. But let's look at our questions right here. Oh, look at this question. If you were in the story, what would you hear, taste, feel, or smell? What would it feel like if you tasted a Litmus Lounge? And what does the character setting look like? Where's the story taking place? What's happening? A lot has been happening in here. Okay, thanks so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.